Good morning, good afternoon, good evening actually to everyone. This is a global session and we've got people joining from around the world. So not only are we in the UK at the moment, but we've got an audience in the UAE, for example, all the way through to Australia. So I don't know what time it is for you people over there, but it's probably going to be pretty late and some of you might be catching up on the recording as well. So a huge warm welcome to you. We've had over 300 registrations from global leading organizations through to SMEs. And the common theme that we've seen in the people like you that have attended and attending today is you truly care about well-being. And what a stellar lineup we've got today. We've got the rock stars from Nick Davison. He's even got the ukulele in the background, perfectly placed, all the way through to the likes of Dr. Richard Herron, Dr. Vicky Barnes, Andy Holmes, and Dr. Stephanie Fitzgerald as well today. So a huge warm welcome to you. I think a few of you already are popping in the chat where you've joined from. So we can already see Victoria, Saudi Arabia, Tim, London, Martin, Eastbourne, the south coast of England. Pretty sure it's going to be scorching down there today, all the way through to Dundee in Scotland. So a huge warm welcome to you all. Really good to see you as well. So in terms of today's session, we would love you to ask as many questions and add as many comments as possible. The reason why we put on this session is to really give you the experts' knowledge, the boots on the ground from leading global organizations as to what we can be doing to be able to better employee health and well-being and high performance throughout our organizations. And again, what better people to be able to talk to and discuss today. So please put in any questions that you've got. We've got 8 questions from people already prior to today's session. Any additional ones, we would love to hear from you. And if we don't get round to them, my personal promise to you is we will get round to them at the end of the session. If you want to just say, I would love to hear Nick's opinion on this, or might be Vicky's opinion on a certain question off the back of the conversation, again, please pop that in the chat and we will get back to you after today's session. We will also send this through via email as a recording too, so you don't need to just scribble down all of your notes and get RSI from writing down all of the notes, and because there's going to be so many takeaways. You'll get the recording through so you can watch it back in your own time going forward, but we would like this to be as interactive as possible. And the final thing that I'll ask you to do, and I'll only ask you to do this if you get value from the session, is to share it with your colleagues, your friends, and anyone else that could benefit from these sessions. We put these on free of charge to be able to support people like you, and word of mouth is the best way to be able to extend our impact together to create the healthy, happy and thriving organizations that we strive to be a part of. Now, one thing before I introduce the stellar lineup that we've got today is a guide that we've put together. And I'll be honest, I wish that we didn't have to put together this guide. Financial well-being is something that's impacting employees across the globe in a huge way, and it's affecting absolutely everyone. What we've put together is first-party data and data we've never seen before from Champion Health, which is showing the correlate between employee well-being, financial stress, productivity and performance. But it's not only just showing you the data, it's also sharing with you what you can do and what other leading organizations are doing going forward. So there are actionable tips that you can take forward. And I know a few of the conversations and comments from you attending today have been around financial well-being, which we'll touch upon in the Q&A section of today's session. So please download the guide. Alex, if he's not already done it, we'll pop it as a link he's already one step ahead. Pop it as a link in the chat function and have a look through it, because it's absolutely invaluable. And we know that financial well-being is heavily linked with employee well-being, happiness and performance as well. So introducing to you the Global Wellbeing Advisory Board, and that's really why you're here today, is to hear from the best in the business around workplace health and well-being. Now, to introduce to you the 6 speakers, and it's actually 5 speakers now because Jamie has had an urgent thing that he's had to attend today, so he passes on his apologies, but we're going to make sure that we get Jamie and Artie. Jamie's the head of wellbeing at Serco, Artie's the head of wellbeing at Ocado, other members of our Global Wellbeing Advisory Board on our next sessions into the future. But the first person that I wanted to introduce was Dr. Stephanie Fitzgerald, and I feel really privileged to be able to introduce people like Dr. Steph that I really aspire to become in my career and really look up to. And Dr. Steph has looked at global strategies, headed up the mental health and wellbeing strategy at Rolls-Royce, is a clinical psychologist, and also is going to be a best-selling author. Has already published 2 books, I think, Steph, and there's another one on its way, 3 books and another one on its way. So please, please, please ask her around the books, and that'll be a fascinating conversation. We've then got Nick Davison, and Nick headed up the wellbeing strategy at John Lewis, head of wellbeing at John Lewis, and also head of health at Aviva previously as well. So he's been on the supplier side and also the organizational side of things, and will share his expertise around organizational change and practice and how to implement initiatives in a successful way. The third speaker that I'd love to introduce, a member of the Global Wellbeing Advisory Board, is Dr. Vicky Barnes. And Vicky is a global international speaker, a consultant, clinical and organizational psychologist, and has worked with organizations from Virgin all the way through to other global organizations as well. And again, forms a really integral part of our Global Wellbeing Advisory Board. Now, the penultimate person I'd love to introduce is Dr. Richard Herron, and Richard comes at things from a completely different lens. I love the way that Richard thinks about workplace health and wellbeing. Richard's the former Vice President of Health and Chief Medical Officer at BP, has worked with organisations such as the World Health Organization, and will bring a different angle when it comes to workplace health and wellbeing, will get us to think in a different way. He's certainly done that for me already as part of this board. And the final person that I'd love to introduce, a friend of mine, I'm proud to call him a colleague now as well, is Andy Holmes, global speaker again, ex-global head of wellbeing at Reckitt, and also formed part of the GSK strategies in the past, and again is a part of our Global Wellbeing Advisory Board. So a huge welcome to everyone that's joining us on today's session. So where I'm going to start today is actually rewind it. The session today is about the next era of wellbeing, but I want to reflect on where we've come from. And Andy, I'm going to target the first question to you, quite a broad question. How far have we come across the last 5 to 10 years when it comes to wellbeing within our organisations? And then we'll go on to where we can go next.
First of all, I wanted to say, firstly, Harry, thank you for throwing me the first question. I always appreciate that. And secondly, it's wonderful to be in such esteemed company. So it's great to see you all again, and welcome to everyone on the line. I think for me, when you ask that question, it really depends what your frame of reference or frame of success is. I think there's been an awful lot of focus on individual well-being under the guise of corporate and employee well-being, but I think we've still got a fair way to go when we look at allowing well-being to challenge the way that we operate and the cadence with which we do so in a corporate environment. So I think we've done a lot to appease and to support employees. I think for me, the next stage is really about how do organizations and corporations really start to lean in and see this not just as a responsibility, but as an opportunity, as a moral responsibility, but also as the future. You know, this is where we are going to progress and evolve and elevate to. This is not something that I think we should be looking at as how do we fix it, tick the box and move on to something else. This needs to be part of the journey for the long term.
And that's going to be a big theme that we're going to discuss, is how do we get buy-in from senior leadership all the way through to boots on the ground. And I'm going to pass that next question to you, Richard, because you've headed up a global wellbeing strategy and health and safety strategy for how many people? Tens of thousands of people. What's been some of the key learnings that you've taken in the past from being able to get those senior leaders on board and the rest of the team?
Goodness me. Well, yes. So latterly at BP, we had up to 85,000 employees in over 65 countries. So it was a pretty big challenge. I think the first thing was, I think, we understand we're all human beings. So we have the same basic physiology, but understanding the culture of health and well-being, what the expectations are in terms of health and well-being, is a very personal thing, and it's a very culturally driven thing. So in different countries, it's been one of my learnings is actually find people who really have been born, brought up, and really understand the constituents, the population, because they're my boots on the ground, my eyes and ears, and they stop me making all sorts of footfalls and falling into elephant traps everywhere with thinking I know something and I really, really don't. So I think that's one thing, is surround yourselves with people who really know the population that you're trying to actually support. When it comes to the leaders, this is a big question that keeps coming back. You know, how do you get the CEO on board? How do you get the executive team on board? And it is, I mean, it's a well-trodden phrase. It's a journey, but I think there are a few tips that I found helpful over time. Yeah, I talk about zealots and converts. There's almost always somebody who's already on board with well-being somewhere in the senior leadership sort of space. Getting to them gives you access to who, how, and what are the sort of decision-making points that will help you get your programs and your sort of strategy embedded, rather than you spending an awful lot of time talking to the wrong people, not really knowing who's going to make stuff happen or get in your way. So I think start with those people, but quite quickly, if you can, identify the most cynical, most unbelieving person in the room and work that space until you convert them. Because once you've done that, you've actually got somebody there who's traditionally not thought to be a fan of health and well-being, who starts talking positively about it, and everybody listens, and it really does sort of shift the ball up the pitch like that. Many other things, and lots of scars on the back, but that's just a couple to begin with, I would think, Harry.
Fantastic. That's a lovely warm-up, and I know it's a very broad question to throw at both yourself and Andy. And if we look at marketing strategies, there's nothing more powerful in a marketing strategy than someone saying, I wasn't a fan of this, but I've used it, and look at me now. And that's a really powerful thing, again, when it comes to well-being. So I absolutely love the zealots and the converts analogy within there. And there'll be plenty more analogies, I'm sure, to come as well. Steph, you've been a clinical psychologist for a good amount of time now, and you must have seen the mental health space evolve in a big way. What's that evolution been like from your standpoint, especially heading up the mental health strategy at Rolls-Royce as well?
Yeah, so definitely some quite big shifts, I think it's fair to say. I think people have really identified mental health as something that they need to pay attention to. And I think the pandemic was a real leveler in that sense. So people who previously thought, oh, this is a nice to have, or this is a bit pink and fluffy, or, oh, you know, I don't need to worry about that. When we all experienced social isolation and, you know, withdrawal, and we couldn't take part in our usual, you know, pleasurable activities because everything was shut. I think people got an insight into that's what living with depression looks like, that's what living with constant anxiety looks like. So I think there was a real leveler. And I think certainly when I first started working mental health, there was a real emphasis on someone having to be brave in companies and sort of step forward with their story, and they'd be like, well, this is me and this was my experience, and everyone was like, wow, you know, gosh, that's so brave, I'd never talk about my mental health. And you know, you fast forward 10 years and actually everyone's talking about their mental health. Everyone has this openness and this willingness to engage in the conversation, and I think we've moved away from that, why you talk about that at work, that's private, into a space that's much more, this is part of me, and I have to take care of my mental health in the same way that I take care of my physical health. So I think there's definitely been some real openness that's developed around the conversation. And I think what's really important is that people are recognizing that there doesn't need to be a stigma around mental health. It's normal to have good days and bad days. Yeah. It's normal for your mental health to fluctuate in the same way it's normal for your physical health to fluctuate. And actually, we need to respond in the same way. So I think that's definitely been a positive that's come out of it. I think my only hesitation is I think we've moved slightly into an era of toxic positivity where the aim is to feel good 100% all the time. And I just think that's kind of setting us up to fail. So I think there's been some really positive movement forward, but there's some tweaking to be done.
Fantastic. And that's the purpose of today's session, so we can all get in the right direction, moving in the same, we get in the boat in the same direction. And that is a perfect segue onto Vicky and your background as well as a clinical psychologist and positive psychologist, again, working with the likes of Virgin, all the way through to speaking with global organizations. What have you found across the last 5 to 10 years and the learnings that you've seen across organizations in terms of that change?
I think that I'll agree with what everybody else is kind of saying, and on top of, I think that what people are getting to grips with now is that you are a human being, no matter whether you're at work or at home. And whilst we can put our work hat on and we can turn up and we can do our job really well, and you have roles and responsibilities, so you kind of, there's a have to and a got to, but there's also a me within that, like where do I sit within that? And when people have got personal struggles or even work struggles and just life, you know, as Steph's just rightly said, you know, we've all been through a lot the last couple of years. I think that people are starting to realize that it's not a case of bringing all your troubles into the workplace, because some people are more comfortable with being able to talk about things like that, and that's where psychological safety comes into play. But it is about us recognizing that we are human beings. We're not computers, we're not robots. Our brains don't work in that way, our bodies don't work in that way. We have mental health, and our minds minds are coming with us into the workplace. So if our minds are struggling at home, they're also struggling at work. And if we're at work and we're keeping it together, what happens is we go home and then it all kind of falls apart. And that we don't want that. We don't want to interrupt our personal lives, our home lives. Our home should be our sanctuary, right? And our family should get the best of us, not the worst of us. And so I think that there's something about being able to be psychologically safe and appropriate in the workplace and bring what's relevant into work. And all of this lovely stuff that I'm hearing about vulnerability and authentic leadership, I absolutely love that that's the way that things are going now. And that's been my biggest, what I've noticed is the biggest shift over the last few years.
Fantastic. And we're going to build on that going forwards, and especially around psychological safety. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts in terms of how they've implemented it, the challenges that you've faced as well, across the community of everyone listening today. But before we build on that, Nick, would love to get your thoughts of how do you build a wellbeing strategy for 80,000 people? There's a few other questions I've got around that, but that's a big challenge, right?
It's a huge challenge, and I think echoing really what the others have said, particularly Vicky's last point, is you've got 80,000 unique individuals, and I think what you need to do is create a kind of clear vision of what that looks like in terms of their needs, but also then how you provide those opportunities. Because what you can't do as an employer is be all things to all people. And I think whilst there's an individual, you want to encourage individuals to own their own health and well-being, because we're all personally responsible for it, right? But the impact as an employer on your productivity and your performance at work and your cohesion as teams is absolutely reliant on that sense of togetherness and actually in it together, coming to life. So I think, how do you do that? You need data, you need insight, you need information. You also need to recognise that actually within your population, you've got different people with similar traits. So actually, how many of those are, what pools do they kind of create, and actually where can you galvanize people into communities within your own organization? I think that's where you start to get some really telling things, whether that's around different characteristics, whether that's around mental health, whether that's around things like the menopause. You want people to engage and be part of the solution rather than waiting to be kind of invited to be kind of done to or take part.
I absolutely love that, and doing things with, not to, is a big theme. And there are already some themes appearing, and we'll look to construct them and deconstruct them a little bit more going forwards, especially that personalisation element within here. I'm loving seeing the chat popping up as well. It's a big challenge for me in terms of making sure I'm listening and also reading all the comments. So we'll make sure we go through to them shortly. Andy, you have a big discussion point around just being right of average consistently. There's a big theme in the workplace at the moment of always performing to your highest peak potential. That's something that you look to actually challenge around that and bringing your whole self to work. And actually, we can't perform 100% every single day. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that for the audience?
Yeah, of course. And I think it's always wonderful being part of these panels, because you hear other people speak and you're like, yes, that's what I think. Steph, you were saying about, people are expecting to feel good all the time. I think what I've observed and seen is that a lot of organizations, we're either focusing, if you look at the bell curve, we're either focusing on hearing from Olympians telling us how they achieved Olympic gold 10 times, whilst managing a family of 10, or we're hearing from people who are having burnout and mental health issues. The challenge is that for a large number of organizations, that's not the norm. We've got 70% of people in the middle of the bell curve who are neither going to be Olympians and hopefully will not have burnout or mental health challenges. So how do we ensure that we have relevance? But then also, how do we ensure that we are authentic? Vicky was talking about, the work that she does. And a lot of the work that I've done talks about contentment being the goal. We shouldn't be seeking to be euphoric the whole time. That's not sustainable. Our mood is there to get us to shift. So, some of the work we've been doing with CHX, an organization I know you know, Harry, is about how do you stay just right of the middle, just right of average more of the time, more consistently, more sustainably. The other key thing about this is that, as Nick said, the great thing about well-being is that we're all different, but we're all the same. We all have the same biology to a large degree, but we all have a different preference. We all have different ways that we seek to support or access that. So for me, I think we need to spend less time as organizations doing, telling, educating, and more time listening and facilitating, and allowing that listening and facilitation to inform the way that we as an organization operate, that we as a community, as a social network interact. And that should be geared about driving people towards people and helping everyone to just shift right a little bit more consistently day to day. Because if you do that, you win more often than you lose.
Yeah.
You know, we have this thing we talked about around mission mode, where people might have 10 things that they typically do that mean that they win their day. But we all know, a bit like Jamie's got today, there will be days when that goes the wrong way. And the problem is, if you spend your days failing at 10 things, wouldn't it be better to succeed at 5? You know, so how do you switch modes to be more consistent and stay right of average more consistently than not? And I think if we could try and embrace that and try and drive towards it, it would mean that we'd have people taking progressive steps rather than 2 steps forwards, 1 step back every day of their lives. And that's got to be a better place to be.
Fantastic. Love that message, Andy. I've got a follow-up question directly to yourself as well around the importance of education versus listening. How important is listening within all of this? Because a lot of programs look at education, training. It seems to be adding, and Richard, I'm going to go to your balloon analogy shortly on that as well. But how important is listening within the whole of the employee wellbeing strategy?
I think for me, I mean, it's absolutely critical. You know, I think if I was to be cynical, I would say that if you ask people how many hours sleep should they get, what should they eat, how many hours exercise they should do, most people know that stuff. The problem is not that they don't know what they should be doing, it's that how do you get to that tipping point where you actually get to be able to do it, and that it's not at odds with the environment you operate in or the operating model or the cadence of the business you're with. I think the wonderful thing, you know, is all having been through your champion survey when you join the platform, the wonderful thing is that it encourages you to listen to yourself. And that's the first step of any well-being strategy. The challenge is that most organizations don't approach this from listen to yourself. They approach it from, we want to hear from you. And as soon as you ask the question in that way, you're relying on someone feeling psychologically safe, having faith in the process, knowing there are going to be no repercussions, trusting their leadership. And those are often the barriers to people achieving a state of well-being. So for me, you know, I don't know how we do it, and this is why we're here, but getting people to listen to themselves, just like your survey does, that's got to be the first bit. The freedom, the security, the intimacy to be able to listen to yourself and understand yourself has to be at the core.
I think that's a really powerful message. And yeah, for me, it's absolutely key to be able to empower the individual, but also to be able to create the environment that the individual thrives in. And that goes on to my next question, Richard, for yourself, around how important is it to empower the individual, but also to look at the social factors, the interpersonal factors, and also the organizational environment to get well-being right? It's not just one of those, it's all three. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. And, you know, I think when we were talking about the journey of well-being that we've been on, we sometimes think of it as kind of the preventive side through to the understanding and awareness side, through to the actual sort of helping people when things go wrong side. An awful lot has happened on the helping people when things go wrong. But when you look into organizations, particularly, you know, people at work or people who are, you know, in work, the impact of their employer on their well-being is enormous. You know, we spend the majority of our waking hours at work, many of us. So that is the environment which really shapes how we feel. And again, you know, as I think Vicky and Stephanie both said, you know, you don't want to bring that home with you, and having had, you know, bad day at work equals bad day at home, and a cycle in that way. So I think unless you address each of those, all you do is start to squeeze a balloon. So you might think you're making something smaller here, but actually it's going bigger over here. If you haven't addressed some of those antecedents, some of those big things, you know, in a workplace that could be affecting people. So, you know, Vicky, you mentioned authentic leadership. That's about listening. I mean, it's very basic, simple things. I think this isn't about heavy science, actually. Most people want to feel that you notice them. You know, you actually notice them. And in a workplace, many people feel that they sit there all day and people just walk past them and they don't notice them, and that doesn't feel good. So I think a simple thing is actually sort of noticing somebody, but then you have to let them know you noticed them. So you have to actually say something or or, you know, hello, or, you know, how are you, or whatever, something like that. And then I think by letting them know you notice, you're actually starting to let them know you care about them, and you start to sort of take an interest, and that's beginning to listen more to people. And I think it's fundamentally a gap, you know, in workplaces, is time to listen, and it's just the most valuable thing, really, in terms of actually understanding needs. We reach for the, you know, what do you think we should introduce here? What program should we start? And we look at the, you know, all the sort of glittery sweets in the sweet shop that look good, without actually asking people what their needs are. You know, and I think that's the fundamental starting point. What is it that's driving your well-being? I mean, we don't necessarily ask it like that. And until we've asked that, in some way of the 60,000 in Nick's, you know, space, or 85, and actually taking that into account, we're likely to introduce something that's of no relevance at all, or actually could be worse than that. We've actually said this is something that's going to help you with your well-being, and it patently doesn't. So you start to actually erode that sense of trust and care by an employer for an employee. So I think really some of these things are fundamentally very, very simple constructs. But then I guess the other thing that you know, touches on some of the questions in there is, you really have to know your organization and the people who are running it to know how to sort of tune in to really blending what works for individuals into what makes sense for an organization. And again, you can't do those things separately. You really have to understand the culture in the organization and what it will accept and when and how. And in some ways be patient, actually, and very thoughtful about that.
Yeah, fantastic. And it comes back to a lot of the points around listening. And I think from the chat, from what I can see, so many people are agreeing with your statements there, Richard. Lynn's mentioned Richard's point about people wanting to be noticed is so simple and true. Remote working does make that more challenging. And that's something we're going to touch upon shortly. And there were some of the questions coming through. And Rob's also mentioned, I'd agree and I'd second this, Rob, love the balloon analogy, that not adding stuff all the time will mean that the balloon will get wider and bigger somewhere else and add pressure somewhere else. So how do we take away from people? Because we know from our data that lack of time is the biggest barrier to engaging with wellbeing and improving it going forwards. Steph, something that I would love to touch on, I'm sure you've got some comments off the back of what's been said as well to add to, but you really helped reframe something for me the other week, and I want to say thank you for that, first of all. But a lot of people, and myself included, we're talking about reaching the hard to reach populations, the populations that are typically harder to engage, and you actually reframed it to something else. Can you just share that with the audience today? Because I think that would be really valuable for anyone building a wellbeing strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. So the conversation that we were having, so just for context, so my background, both as a clinical psychologist, but also working as a health and wellbeing consultant, has been predominantly male-dominated industries and safety critical. So these are, you know, science, engineering, technology environments, absolutely full of respectfully middle-aged men who, whenever you start talking about well-being, people say to me, men don't want to talk about their mental health. And what I've found is that that's nonsense. Men don't want to talk about their mental health if you tell them that men don't want to talk about their mental health. It's almost like somehow we're not giving them permission to talk. And as a man, if you're consistently told, oh, you don't want to talk about your mental health, then it's almost as though that permission to talk about it has been taken away from you. So I can genuinely say that's not my clinical or my corporate experience. My clinical caseload, I used to work in military trauma, so predominantly, in fact, at points, 100% male caseload. People talk about their mental health, and certainly in the industries I've worked in, predominantly male men talk about their mental health. So I think it's really important that rather than seeing these populations as, gosh, you know, aren't these challenging, aren't these really hard to reach, we instead think, gosh, isn't there an amazing opportunity to make a real difference here and to undo some of the damage that society does when we raise men with big boys don't cry. Yeah. You know, what an incredible opportunity to use a platform. I really like the conversation we were having earlier about starting to tune into yourself and listen to yourself. And as we said, something like the Champion Health app actually leads people into, I may never have talked to anyone about this, so how about I start with a conversation about my own well-being, and I start to ask myself, and then I reframe that you know, into a wider conversation. But I would absolutely say that men do want to talk about their mental health. We just need to stop telling them that they don't.
Absolutely. And I think it's such an empowering message. And from my backstory, which many of you may know, I lost my friend and mentor to suicide. He was 45 years old, incredibly successful, amazing guy. And I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for James's help and support. And I just wonder, if we reframe that conversation, how many people we can help going forward. So what an uplifting message. And I just want to say thank you for sharing that, Steph. And what I'd love to do now is move on to yourself, Vicky, again, as a clinical psychologist in your background around remote working. And that's a big theme that's come up in the questions as well from what people have asked. How do we engage a remote workforce, and how do we connect them? That's going to be a huge part of wellbeing strategies for those organisations that are available to be able to be a remote workforce.
It's a really important question, Harry. I think it's something that's at the forefront of all of our minds now. And I do think that it's really, really important. But I also think that it comes down to something that was already there, so in the office as well. And it's to do with people's preferences and personality types and how they like to live their lives. So one thing that I found, I think, is absolutely vital for people to get a handle of in organisations when they're needing to monitor people's mental health is what their preferences are. So for example, and this isn't kind of exclusive, but this is just a generalization to make a point, right? But for example, extroverts tend to get their energy from being around people. So they would like a busy office space. They'd be able to work perhaps more efficiently with some more noise and activity around them than your average introvert, who might appreciate that home space and being able to create their own little bubble, hopefully in a corner of a room or a separate room at home or in the garden if it's me, or whatever it might be. So you have got differences in people. So what we can't do is assume that, right, everybody's struggling working from home, so we need to bring everybody back into the office now, or vice versa. Everybody prefers working from home because it's easier and you know, they can get more done. We can't make those huge generalized assumptions. So I think the first thing is to make something that's going to work for people accessible to everybody, and just ask those questions. And it's not always viable. If you've got a huge organization like Virgin, you can't ask every individual and make a kind of separate role and timesheet for everybody, but you can definitely, within teams, you can work out who needs what, how much do we need to interact with each other, do we need a buddy system, do we need check-ins, how often should we meet face to face, do we need to do online videos, or are we okay with audio, you know, and kind of who needs to get together and who's okay not to, and meeting clients and things like that as well. Some people have much more client-facing parts of their roles, and they might be okay with that, and then that's kind of enough people for them. And some people are very isolated, and they are the people that we need to ask. And I think there's something as well, just going back to a technique, which is, a couple of people have mentioned this now, we ask and we ask again. So you can't just ask the question, because I think that a workforce feels like, okay, this is just another questionnaire, this is just another check-in on my mental health, and it might not mean anything, like it's lip service. So we really want to not do that. We want to ask and ask again, like, how are you doing? How are you doing, really? The Ask Twice campaign by Time to Change was amazing, I think, and that was what that was all about. But we really need to recognise that everybody's individual, and personality type and understanding people's preferences is vital. And personally, I think it probably starts with some information and guidance around that.
That's a fantastic message again. And I think it goes back to that key theme that we've mentioned of listening again, asking the question, listening and acting upon it. That's the way to create an engaged team. And that is somewhat oversimplified, but it's a good formula to go by. Just a personal story, Andy, I'll go to your question in a moment. I struggled with my mental health at university. I'm very open about it now. And it took my tutor to spot the warning signs. And he asked me how I was. He pulled me to one side in a very empathetic way. And I said, I'm okay. And he said, Harry, how are you really doing? I've seen grades aren't quite where they're meant to be for where you were. You're not turning up. You're not necessarily the life and soul of the group anymore. Is everything okay? And I opened up, and it was the best thing that I'd ever done. And it was just the permission that he gave, the authenticity, and that he truly meant it as well. And that led to me, I was just about to drop out of university. That led to me going to get therapy. He signposted me to the right place. He listened. And that was the power of something so small that's led to something that's monumental across my lifetime. So I just wanted to echo your point there, Vicky, with a personal story myself as well. Nick, I'm going to go to you with personalisation in a moment's time, but Andy, I've seen your arms up. So I'd love to just get your thoughts.
It was just a quick build on what Vicky said, because I think, you know, wholeheartedly agree with everything that Vicky's saying. And it was just something I wanted to seed in for the people listening, is that from what I've observed, and I know conversations I've with Richard and Nick as well, organizations quite often start out with the right intent, but very quickly we start to focus on how do we control it, how do we measure it, and how do we manage it. Everyone's heard of 80-20. I would really encourage people to spend 80% of your time focused on what is it that we want people to feel, how do we want them to respond, and what do we want them to experience, and then spend 20% of the time on how do we measure it, how do we manage it. Because the reality is, in order for well-being to be authentic, it has to be organic. And some of this is about really tightly focusing on what does your picture of success look like from an employee experience point of view, rather than from a management and measurement point of view. If you do it that way, hopefully you will get to a point where you have a well-being strategy and approach and interventions that are fit for purpose, not just giving you metrics that allow you to control it. And that was just the one point I wanted to mention there, Harry. I think it's really key. You know, time and time again, I know all of us see organizations who are purchasing and procuring stuff without having a vision of what do we want people to feel if we get this right. And that's got to be the starting point. It has to be the anchor point.
And absolutely, and I would echo that from a Champion Health perspective, that we have always started with what is it that you want to achieve, and often it's we want a platform. But what is it that you want the platform to achieve? And sometimes we're not right, and we talk ourselves out of work. Sometimes we are right for the organisation going forwards as well. And I think that's a really important theme. I'm just going to ask a slightly tricky question to you there, Andy, and be an awkward host. Off the back of that, many of the senior leaders I've spoken to are wanting data. They've got to the positions they're in because of data-driven decisions. They love the data. But a lot of this, you say 80% within the 80-20 analogy, isn't around data, it's around feel, it's around experience. So how do you get those leaders that are very data-driven on board initially with that story? I'd love to just hear your thoughts.
For me, there was actually something popped up in the chat about confidence for junior people in organizations. I think one of the biggest challenges at the moment is confidence for senior people in organizations. If you look a lot of the time, what data gives senior people in organizations is reassurance and confidence. I think if a senior person asks you to provide data, our first question should be, if we get that data, what are you going to do with it? And how's it going to change your thinking, your approach, and what people experience? The question needs to go back. Too often we see senior people demand data, junior people provide the data, senior people don't do anything with the data, nothing changes. The question has to go back. If we get this data, what are you expecting it to tell you? And if it doesn't tell you that, what are you prepared to do? I think for me, that would be the big push. You need to understand the intent and what security, what confidence, what comfort, what protection in some instances does that senior person need in order to take a leap with well-being.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful message, and you can see all the thumbs up going through the chat as well. Nick, I'm going to touch upon personalisation with you, and I've got a few other themes that we'd love to touch upon with financial well-being, where to start with your well-being strategy if you are at the start or if you want to reevaluate. But how important is personalisation, especially, again, 80,000 people, all unique, all with their own unique DNA, wants, needs, challenges, some common themes within there. How important is personalisation from your experience?
I think it's critical, and I think technology is enabling much greater personalisation than ever was possible before. But I think to build on Andy's point, when people want data, actually they don't really want data; they want insight. And actually, they don't know. You don't know what you don't know, right? So there was a question in the chat earlier on from Ben asking around, the relevance of traditional kind of HR pulse surveys, and if you ask generic questions routinely, you're going to get vanilla responses, right? And actually your engagement levels won't be great. And I think where the personalization comes back to, and again, somebody else mentioned this in the chat, the Champion Health questionnaire gives you a very specific view of yourself, but as an employer, aggregated information and insight from those types of sources means that you start to create an agenda around what's important to our people. And actually, what should we be doing to actually make changes to what we provide and how that's delivered in a way that they will engage with. Because my biggest kind of concern is that we're entering, certainly in the UK and other parts of the world, a period of great uncertainty around recession and financial and economics around all of that, where actually we already have a polarized workforce. Those that are engaged, those that take their own responsibilities seriously, do something proactive around the way they live their lives through great choices, but an awful lot that don't. And actually, if you layer on top of that the realities of recession, and then this will be my fifth during my working life that I've worked through, where unemployment goes up, where people lose their jobs, where there's not enough money, all those negative things have real bite to people's lives. So there is a very real challenge, I think, for employers to make sure that you don't leave people behind. And I think that's where the personalization comes from, is understanding what's important to different parts of your organization.
And that's been a fascinating learning for us looking at the data from Champion, is that some people want to look at their mental health, some people want to look at sleep, others it's parenting, others it's performance and productivity. And ironically, if we improve our sleep, we improve our mental health as well. And that's a really key theme for us. And the data has just been absolutely fascinating, that it's not a one size fits all within there. Nick, I'd like to just ask one more question. We've had a lot around this because it's so timely. Employees are all feeling the pinch, and the media storm that's going on at the moment around inflation, cost of living rises, and a potential recession. What can organisations do around financial well-being? Obviously, we've got the report there, and you're part of that report. But I just wanted to get a live response from you today, if that's okay.
Of course, and I think there's some practical things. So I think you can provide educational material. Certainly, John Lewis. We've got a relationship with a provider that actually allows people to develop their learning and their understanding of how to budget, how to create basic actionable differences to their finances. As an employer, clearly there's a relationship between what you pay people and how you reward people and how that money's spent. And even when money's tight, there are choices for employers around how they do that. And I think then there's also to what degree and what capability have you got to support people in times of trouble. Whether that's financially directly around grants or short-term loans, because you come back to the physiological needs. People need food, they need somewhere to live. And if the bailiffs are knocking on the door, rents are going through the roof, particularly in our big urban areas in the UK. You need to kind of help people stuck in those sort of circumstances. And I think there's more practical things around how payrolls and the technicalities of all of that work around, do you give people the opportunity of having payday, advanced paydays and stuff. But I think it's going to be a challenge, depending on who you are, depending on where you work, but not forgetting that unemployment is likely to rise in the next couple of years.
And the context around it for the organisation is absolutely key. That's honestly the trickiest thing when it comes to a webinar, is you don't necessarily have the context of all 150 people that have joined today's session. So the thing that I would always encourage is to apply what we're talking about, listen to what we're talking through, but apply it in your context, because it's very different from Rolls-Royce to John Lewis, for example, going forwards. Richard, something that's been spoken about is, and I've had a few questions on this, is where to start. There are some organisations that have started, and I might go through to Steph shortly on what they can do to evaluate their programmes. But if you were going to an organisation and they were saying, we want a wellbeing strategy, where would you start, and what would the questions be that you'd ask?
Well, I think I'd even go one step back from that, because if you're talking to an audience who are wellbeing professionals or people who are trying to change wellbeing in organizations, really, when I'm talking to my teams, when I was talking to my teams, I said, listen, you need to have the answers to 4 questions in your head at any moment. It's like that, a classic elevator pitch. If somebody asks me, what's on your mind, Richard, that is my opportunity to say, this is what's on my mind, this is what's worrying me, this is what's keeping me up at night. So the first question I need to answer all the time, and when it's about well-being, and that's understanding the context in your organization, the nature of the employees, what their sort of well-being issues might be, so that you actually know what's worrying you about health and well-being. Having then got that very secure so that you can trot that out pretty quick, the next question in your mind should be, and why should that worry the person who's just asked the question? Why should what's keeping me up at night keep you up at night? Because unless that's going to happen, they're not going to do anything about it. So this is about worrying the boss. You know, if this is why you need to worry about this too. So I think that's my second question to be answered. What's worrying me? How do I make that something that's going to keep you up at night? Third question, what should we do about it then? And that's where you say evidence-based interventions for the things that are well-being problems that you're thinking about in that organization. And then I think the fourth question is, and how will we know when we get there? How will we know when we're making progress? So some of that is around data. And I don't think we should be actually ashamed of the data question, but I do think we should treat it with a level of humility, really deep humility. And one of my opening sort of comments when I come back with data is to say, look, I'm looking at numbers and I cannot know the context that you have as a kind of customer or a client or a leader or an individual. So I really need to know whether is what I'm seeing what you are feeling. And that, again, coming back to Andy's point, it's how you feel ultimately, which is that sort of capturing your well-being. And I'm looking at what I'm seeing, which is data, and they may well be different. You know, I may be looking at typical data, normative data, and you might be on the end of the bell curve that Andy mentioned, rather than right in the middle. So I think, you know, that's critically important. I think the other bit about starting is, you know, we want to try and we often want to try and change everything at once or make a big shift. And again, I think, Andy, you talked about that. You know, we don't want to make Olympians out of people who really just want to sort of do a decent day's work, go home kind of thing. But I think the other analogy perhaps in well-being, and again, we are thinking a little bit about the future. You know, what should it feel like is it should be meaningful to people. Yeah, it should be light touch, and you know, it should be kind of in the moment. And it's a bit like sailing. I'm not a sailor, but if you think about trimming the sails, you're making small adjustments to make a better direction on the course of where you want to get to. So if you really want to be, you know, your well-being improved, you don't sort of completely change direction, but you do want to make small adjustments that allow you to sort of get to where you want to go. And I think the other thing about that is you've generally got the wind behind you and you can't feel it. So it's almost, you know, that gentle shift that's more sustainable. If you try and sail into the wind or make a course, it's really, you know, heavy weather and difficult to do. So again, I wouldn't try and sort of solve world hunger in day one. Start with small stuff, really start to understand what the context is and have your 4 questions ready, because you will have an opportunity. And if you miss it, you may never get another go. Yeah, those are really important conversations to be able to have.
Thank you, Richard. And I knew there were going to be some amazing analogies. It's great for me as a visual learner to be able to picture them as well. And I love that theme. Steph, so Richard spoke about where to start and the key 4 questions. And I loved hearing through those. What about the organisations that have implemented things? It may not have done too well. It may have done really well. How do you actually go about evaluating these programmes to see where you're at and then go again for the next year or 2 years or 3 years?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I think it's almost an expanded version of this forum. So what we're doing here as professionals in organisations is we're not sat here saying, no, don't copy my homework, right? Yeah. We're here sharing best practice, we're here sharing our ideas, we're sharing what's worked well for us, and in the hope that other people can pick that up, we can benchmark against each other and we can, you know, continue to improve together. And I think, you know, Richard's point there around sharing data and having some humility around it. I don't know if anyone remembers this. It was 2020, which just feels like a time warp. But some companies were really open about sharing, and it depends what industry you were in, but what they did and where they made mistakes. So we shut our factory floors at this point. We separated our machines by this much at this point. We reduced our air conditioning airflow at this point. And then other people stepped forward and said, oh, we did that 2 weeks later and actually our cases rose. So, you know, that's really good to know for the next wave. And it was all this learning. And we were really humble about it because there was an opportunity to say, no one knows how to respond to this. You know, this is brand new. But that sharing of data saved lives. Yeah. And I think we can't underestimate that when it comes to well-being, that actually sharing what works, sharing what keeps someone mentally healthy and feeling well and happy, that saves lives. And to go back to the measurement point, I think companies can be a bit precious about, but what about our data?
Yeah.
Rather than, so if you said to me, well, you know, does Steph prove wellbeing works? Easy. How many of the thousands of published medical journal papers would you like on your desk to prove that taking care of your employees is good for business? I can pull that up for you in 5 minutes. That is not a challenge. So why do you want your data specifically? What do you think is different about your human beings than everyone else's human beings? So when it comes to evaluating, I want to know what question is it you're actually trying to answer, because it's not, does well-being work? Like, we've answered that question. We've made that case. There are thousands of business cases we could put in front of people, literally thousands of you know, globally applicable well-being strategies. So that's not the question. But the other thing for me when it comes to evaluating, as well as pinning down what exactly is it you're trying to measure and why, is I'm a big fan of external sharing. And I do think that applies some accountability and some gentle pressure to senior leadership teams. So certainly at Rolls-Royce, our wellbeing strategy, we were accountable to our shareholders and our stakeholders. It was externally reported every year. It's on their website. You can go and look at it. But we really made sure that we held ourselves, you know, to account. And I think that's very powerful. And so it does encourage that external sharing, but also just applies just a gentle amount of pressure, which I do think is really important.
Amazing. And I've just come up with a bit of a thought and an idea that I just want to throw out there as a small experiment. I'm sure the champion team are going to love this. They've got a lot of work going on at the moment. But just give me a yes, please in the comments, or a thumbs up. I love the emojis that are popping up as well. I love to see a bit of colour. If you would like to be part of an exclusive community, we've not formed this yet. The exclusive community is almost the Global Wellbeing Advisory Board that are in front of us, and we're happy to share everything. We're very open. Just give me a yes, please, if you'd like to be part of a community, maybe a Slack channel, we'll think about it, in terms of sharing best practice and learnings, mistakes, failings, all of these things. Really honest, I thought that might be the response. So I guess that's the entrepreneur in my brain, just going through it. So I can't keep up with everyone, but we will look to do that, I promise you, and we'll follow on from that. Steph, I think that's a genius idea, and thank you for sharing it as well. Andy, you quickly had your hand up, and I'd love to get your thoughts on everything that's been spoken about.
You've completely thrown me with your little spike of entrepreneurialism, Harry, but you know, not to be surprised. I think it was based on the back of what Richard and Steph were saying as well, in terms of how do we measure this? And you know, I know you guys know this, but for me, measuring well-being isn't necessarily about measuring well-being. What I'm seeing is too many organizations focusing on measuring well-being. What that ultimately ends up being is, how can we measure whether investment in well-being is commercially viable for us? The problem is that you don't realize a lot of the upsides. You know, I've seen a lot in the charts about absenteeism, you know, sick leave, etc., etc. That for me is not what well-being should be about. You know, that for me is in some ways an organization saying, well, how do we invest that we have everyone in our organization the whole time? For me, well-being is about energy. It's about freedom. It's about choice. It's about engagement. It's about voluntary, discretionary effort. All of these over and above that we are able to give as human beings, if we are well resourced personally, if we are free, if we have support, if we have people around us who are joined up in our thinking. And so for me, I guess the big push I'd be giving to everyone on the call is, how do you look across D&I, across leadership, across culture, across engagement, not just the HR metrics around sick leave, around how many people are taking their holidays, around what your attrition rates are, etc., etc. So how do you start to make well-being much more broad spectrum in terms of what you're looking to in terms of success? I'm going to stop talking now because Richard's got a balloon type grin on his face. So I think he's got something special for us.
Oh, I'm just checking I'm not on mute. Good. Yeah, Andy, I made a kind of tweet or a kind of LinkedIn comment earlier in the week about almost a psychological contract between an employer and an employee, which is around trust and autonomy. And I think there's a really fundamental piece of, you know, understanding about this. employers quite often don't trust their employees to deliver. I mean, the sort of extreme of that, if I can't see what you're doing, you can't be doing anything, is the extreme. You know, if you're not screwed to your desk, you probably aren't doing something. If you're at home, you're probably not working. I mean, that's a kind of extreme version of this. But when we talk about sort of flexibility and what we're coming out of pandemic and remote, flexibility isn't sort of one day off a week and it happens to be Thursday, or it's, you know, we're doing a 2018 or some kind of, you know, particular thing. It's actually about autonomy. It's about me choosing how I would like to work best. So you have to trade that autonomy with the trust of the employer. And I think you have to really work that space both ends. If trust is low, you have to build trust between employer and employees the other way. If autonomy is too strong, you know, it's my, you know, it's up to me how I work, without actually showing the other side of it, which I can understand what you need and how I can help you to do that. So as I say, I mean, I don't want to be sort of throw too much cold water on the whole idea of, you know, employees can do what they want sort of thing and be autonomous, which I really do think is a massive, you know, piece of better performance, better sense of well-being, and better for organizations. I think I always sort of try and think of this as aligning objectives between different stakeholders. It's a bit kind of mechanical, but those stakeholders in this case, employer, employee, equally it could be public perception. So to Steph's point, organizations that are open and share their learning are actually highly respected by the public, for a start, by stakeholders and ethical investors, second. And in a world that is becoming multi-stakeholder, organizations cannot afford not to take that seriously. And that's where this is going. So you've got to think about all your stakeholders, all of your stakeholders. And, you know, as I think, as Nick said, you can't, you know, be all things to all people, but you have to try. You have to try to be that. And you can't give up on that from the get-go, really. So have that in mind. Try and be all things to all people, but don't, you know, you can't be a slave to that endpoint. Really have that in the back of your mind.
That's a fantastic message. And Vicky, I did have a question for you. I'd love to get your thoughts on. We might actually do a blog because we've got 3 minutes left now. And I've absolutely loved listening to all of you. I think these sessions should be 6 hours, but that would be a bit of a marathon, and you've got day jobs to crack on with, not just the panelists, but also all of you amazing attendees. So maybe we do a blog on training, because I think that's a really big area and a huge area that you look at. So we'll look to do that in the next few weeks. But what I wanted to do, just to recap, was there are some really key themes appearing through, and the diversity of thought that we have across this panel and the diversity of experience is absolutely incredible. So my objective from today was to be able for myself to take one thing away that I can implement with Champion Health, with our members. And I hope that you can do the same as well, because it's just so action-packed and action-filled. If you can do one thing, then that will be wonderful. What I also promised you is that if there are any questions that go unanswered, some of them we've grouped into themes because they had specific themes such as remote working or financial well-being. The field of mental health and well-being is so vast that it's hard to answer every single one. I will go back to you directly and answer those questions. I can't promise that I'll come back to the comments because there are just so many, but what we'd love is for you to give your thoughts and your feedback. And that goes on to the penultimate point. If you're able to give your feedback, I read through every single comment that you send through. We love to listen, we love to learn more, see what we can do better for the next session and the session after that to help people like you go forwards and really drive well-being across your organization. Now, finally, there are 3 thank yous that I just want to give today. One is for the box at the bottom, and in much more than a box, Alex from Champion Health. Alex does so much in organising these sessions. They're free of charge, and that's just one thing that we've promised to do, is to always make our experts and our expert advice free of charge. Alex does so much work behind the scenes. It's absolutely incredible. So thank you, Alex. The second thank you is to the panelists today. I know how busy you all are, and it's amazing to have you part of the Champion Health team, Champion Health mission, so we can continue to achieve the mission that we're on and continually evaluate and develop and innovate. And the third thank you is to all of you that attended today for really prioritising employee wellbeing across your organisations. We really value that as a community. We're going to set up that Slack community, or what that looks like going forward. So I love seeing the responses within there, and hopefully you can share it wide with your friends and family. And the final point, I said the last one was the final point. The final point is, if you are interested in just a bit of a nosy around Champion Health, we'd love to take you through it. Even if it's not the right fit at the moment, we'd love to be able to meet you face to face or virtually to take you through what we can do to empower employee wellbeing and create the environments of psychological safety that we've spoken about today. Thank you so much all for joining. Love this session, love the interactive nature in the chat as well. Have a wonderful lunch or evening if you're based in the UAE, and we will see you on the next session. Thank you all.